وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Today inshallah ta'ala we'll complete our lessons on Usul Fiqh and looking at the last bahath, the last مبحث عفوا investigation or topic التعارض وطرق الدفع, contradictions or apparent differences between evidences and how to deflect them. And so the ulama, when they discuss the issues of fiqh, eventually they can be evidences which seemingly appear to conflict with one another, between the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Quran, or any other of the evidences we studied. So the ulama, they call this a ta'arud, seeming contradiction. One evidence is saying one thing, another evidence is saying another thing. How do we deal with this? How do we know what the correct ruling is? And this you can see is when the ulama, they study the issue and they try to make ijtihad. Right? They make ijtihad, juristic effort to find the correct ruling. And this, you might find, is the cause for most of the differences of opinion between the ulama. Al-ikhtilafu fi at-ta'arudi wa tarjih. That most of the difference of opinion comes in how do you reconcile apparently contradicting texts, which way are we going to deal with it, which approach should we take. And so therefore, when you look at the ikhtilafat, difference of opinion في الفروع الفقه, in the subsidiary issues of fiqh, you will notice it returns back to this. That one group takes one view, another group takes another view. This group uses this evidence, this group uses that evidence, this group responds to their evidence, they respond to their evidence, like this. And this is what most of us are accustomed to when we hear ikhtilaf, versus what we mentioned before, that sometimes it can be a difference of opinion based on the application of one principle. But here we're differing on the fact that we're taking one view over another, or we're siding with one evidence over another, or reconciling two apparently contradicting evidences in one manner, but another group will reconcile them in another manner. So it's important to understand then that when the ulama, they say this is the qawl al-rajih, this is the most correct or preponderant opinion, it always goes back to what the author or the shaykh's view is. Because if the alim is saying this is a rajih indahu, according to him, because it might not be rajih inda ghayrihi, or other than him. So we have to understand then that this is where the four madhabs differ. How can they, or how do they approach these different topics when there seems to be two or more evidence on the table, and taking them all can be available sometimes, and sometimes you have to take one over the other, and there's rules. So there are qawa'id. To help us understand this, first we have to begin with the idea of a contradiction. A ta'arud doesn't exist in the Quran and Sunnah, and we covered this already in our lessons on Ulum al-Quran. There's no such thing as a true contradiction in the Quran and Sunnah. It's only apparent. So the ulama say that when it looks like a difference of opinion, or contradiction, إِنَّمَا هُوَ فِي الظَّاهِرِ, apparently, not in reality. في الواقع, there is no such thing. Because Allah, when He speaks, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He inspires the Rasul to say something, they never contradict. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't contradict. He said something, and later He said something else. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. Allahu alim al-hakim. فلا يتدبرون القرآن, they not reflect upon the Quran. ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا. Had it been from other than Allah, you find lots of contradictions. So we already studied in Ulum al-Quran, contradictions are apparent, not reality. Hence, anyone who claims that there is, we say at-tanaqud wa ta'arud, it's seeming. Tanaqud means contradiction, ta'arud means opposition. It's apparent. But the rule and the job of the alim is to harmonize and to reconcile. And that is one of the signs of the Quran is the book of Allah, but also Islam is true. We're the only religion that we can take seemingly contradicting evidences and harmonize them in the most easiest of manners. Any other religion, they can't do that. ما عندهم, they don't have قواعد ترجيح, Yahud wal Nasara. If you ask them here and here, they have nothing. You ask them, what do you do? Aam al-Khas, he has no idea. And you're going to see, brothers and sisters, that's one of the most important part of our deen. The deen that we're studying, there's nothing equivalent, nothing close. No religion has something like this, not atheists either. They have nothing. Because Allah describes them, بَلْهُمْ فِي شَكٍّ يَلْعَبُونَ. They're just playing around their doubts. And you can ask them questions, how about this and this? Nothing. And if we do this. And if you look at Islam, you and I might be thinking, oh, I don't know how to deal with this. And the ulama, they make the jama', or they combine, harmonize, or they make tarjih, or they make naskh, as we'll see how you do it. So just remember, there's no such thing. It's only apparent. But what do we do when we have this? We have to follow a method. So it's not like qawl al-rajih, something you just say. Okay, you have to move away from that. Someone just says, "Indi," my opinion. No. Tarjih is not a joke. You have to actually have the principles and rules. Otherwise, you're just making up things. وَتَقَوَّ عَلَى اللَّهِ. You're just saying things upon Allah مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, that which you have no knowledge of. So we have to be careful that if we take an opinion, we have to understand once there's a difference of opinion, it already suggests that the evidences have some speculative nature, right? Because remember, the ulama say that you can only have a seemingly contradictory evidences بين دليلين ظنيين, two evidences which are speculative in nature. ظني just means open to interpretation, not two evidences which are قطعيات, clear cut. For example, 5 salah, there's no other hadith or ayah says 6 salah. There's no such thing. It's qat'i, right? So we don't have that. We have other differences. So we'll see that the two evidences, if they're open to interpretation, hence they can be different of opinion. For one of the rules, the ulama always mentioned, you cannot have ijtihad, scholarly and juristic derival of an opinion, except when there is a conditions. First condition, that we're dealing with the evidences which are zahir, that they are open to interpretation. And number two, there is no ijma' on the table. So remember, the ulama always say if there's a nas, a clear-cut text, or an ijma' ummah, there's no ikhtilaf there. So it's very important. Some do ijtihad and amur ijma', where there's ijma', it's haram. A real ijma' is called, you can't do ijtihad. Ijtihad means scholars, they differ to begin with. Why? Number one, there's no nas, there's no clear-cut text. There's zahir, but a nas. Remember the difference between the two? Nas means usually has one interpretation. But zahir means it has multiple interpretation. That's the first condition. And second condition, absence of ijma'. Hence, the scholars differ from before to now. So when you hear ikhtilaf, what are you getting from that? There's no clear-cut text, so don't think there is, because if there was, there would be no ikhtilaf aslan. Right? Sometimes we're different again, be careful. Right? The reason why they're differing is because there's no nas. There's zahir nas, like a zahir text, a clear, apparent, but not a clear-cut absolutely, which means we can interpret it more than one way. And number two, there's no consensus, hence the ulama differed. Because there's no such thing as ijtihad amam nas. Alright, so no one's going to come and say, Wallahu alam, in my opinion, there's a 6 salah. It's a nas, you can't go there, right? This is off the table. Or ijma' ulama. Right, very important, remember these two. So when the ulama mentioned this, that's why today we have to be careful. People calling ijtihad. Ijtihad where? Right, they always ask them, what do you do ijtihad? It's something ijma'. And that's why the ulama, they always remind us, when there's ijtihad, you already understand what's happening. Now, once we have this kind of issue, where there's a open, evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, in absence of difference of opinion, this will lead us then to how do we reconcile these apparent differences. And there are 3 methods to do it. The ulama mentioned there are 3 ways to solve it, or to solve these apparent contradictions. And there are other methods within it. So we'll first talk about the 3 overarching ways, then we'll go into each one. Number 1, we try to use al-jama'. Al-jama' means harmonization. Jama' means you take both evidences or more on the topic and you act on all of them. And how do you do that? You harmonize them by making each one of them, right, with their meanings, the correct meanings, reconciled or in agreement with the other one. So you interpret one hadith one way, another one another way, together they work. Because that's the origin of Quran and Sunnah, that they are complementary, not contradictory. So the first method is called al-jama'. And al-jama'u is the asl, that's the origin. If you have a difference of opinion, we always combine evidences before we do tarjih. Right? Al-jama' awla is always more deserving. So the ulama always mention that principle. If there's a possibility to harmonize the evidences, you must harmonize them. You don't jump to choosing one over the other. Right? So that's what we said before. Al-i'malu. I'malu nusus, acting upon the evidences, awla min ihmalihi, is more deserving than taking one over the other. I'malu nusus means if you can act on both, it's more deserving than taking one over the other. So the first rule and the most powerful one and the most go-to is al-jam'u, reconciliation, harmonization. If that is not possible, because the evidences are maybe too clear or too unable to be harmonized in a clear and effective way, as we'll see some of the strategies, we move to the second method, which is an-naskh, abrogation. And abrogation would mean one of the texts is abrogated and the other one abrogates it. So abrogation is the second method, al-tariqatu thaniya. We have to abrogate one over the other. But abrogation has rules. We need evidence and proof and dates. So for example, if I say this text is abrogated by this text, I need to bring certain conditions, otherwise I can't make that claim. And we said before, the origin of the Quran and Sunnah, most of the Quran and Sunnah is not abrogated. So that's why you find that to be the least used method. Because to claim abrogation, you need dalil. So you can't just say this is a mansukh. No, the evidences which are abrogated are very less. But sometimes we resort to that, as we'll see. And the third one, which is the most common one, because most of the times the ulama differ, they go that direction, which is at-tarjih. At-tarjih means preponderance, choosing one evidence or giving weight to one evidence over the other by suggesting that one evidence has a stronger either chain of transmission or ma'na, meaning, or dalala, indication. There's many ways also say tarjih. So most of us are familiar with this language because the ulama, when they listen to the fatwa, they say qawlun rajih. They're always saying this is the more correct opinion between these opinions and these evidences. What did they do? They analyzed it and they found that one view is stronger than the other and the other view is weaker. Or the evidence that they're using is not strong, or the evidence that they're using, the meaning is not correct, or the etc. So tarjih, preponderance. Now with this being said, the qawa'id tarjih, how do you determine preponderance, has many more principles, as we'll see, but each one of them has rules. Okay, each one has rules. So before continuing, we have these three methods. Al-jam'u, this is harmonization. Wa-naskhu, abrogation. Wa-tarjih, preponderance, choosing one evidence or one in meaning over the other. And each has rules. So what we'll do, we'll keep it right simple because there's lots of discussion there. And it's qawa'id tarjih, right? Fil tafsir, wa fil hadith, and etc. And it's itself very difficult because the person who's doing the tarjih has to be ahlul ilm, right? He has to know these different sciences and what he's doing. But we're just trying to find out how they do it. Our job, study Usul Fiqh, to appreciate the fuqaha and to think and to appreciate the mind of the faqih. Because when you don't know what they're doing, you don't understand how they reach their conclusion. Which is why some people, even when they're studying the deen, they don't understand but also don't appreciate why this ruling was even derived. So yes, an ami person would not know that, but talib al-ilm, he should be at a higher level to appreciate, at least I'm following the conversation. I might not agree with that, but at least I can see why and how they got what they got. That's at least the most important. You know the masalik, how they're reaching their conclusions. Showing us fiqh, like aqidah, like tafsir, ulum hadith, everything has a tariq, a path. So the ahlul ilm, people of knowledge, that's what they follow, a path. If you follow too, you're on that path. Whereas sometimes we find people, when they hear the fatwa of the ulama, they think it's just, he just one day says this, one day says that. It's not like that. Right? There's rules. So let's talk about how harmonization is done. How do ulama harmonize or do a jama'ah? So the scholars, they say the first thing we know is that if there's two apparently contradicting evidences, we try our best to combine them as much as possible by trying to analyze both evidences. How would you do it? Example, scholars will first check the authenticity of both evidences, right? As we'll see. That's the first thing. Are they both evidences sahih? If one is da'if, one is sahih, khalas, there's no ta'arud aslan. One is da'if, and we don't act upon da'if hadith. Put it aside. Again, some da'if hadith can be acted upon if the meaning is correct and supported. But if one hadith is da'if, the other one is sahih, we already know this is where we're going. But let's say we have two evidences. How do you harmonize it? Scholars say you make one restricted, the other, takhsisul am. One of them will be restricted, and the other one is general. Right? Specific and general. So you specify one over the other. So that's one way of doing it. So one hadith you have, another hadith, or one ayah, another ayah. This ayah is general, this ayah is specific. Khalas. So there's no contradiction because this is general, this is specific. There you go, that's it. That's harmonized. We act on both of them. So that's one method. Another method, one ayah or evidence will be mutlaq, unrestricted. Another one will be muqayyad, will be restricted. We studied this, right? So taqyid mutlaq. You take an evidence, two of them. One is you're going to say this one is unrestricted and this one restricted. Khalas. So you put them together in their appropriate settings. Another way you would do it, you say the ruling will go from wajib to mustahab. Jama' adillah. So we have two evidences. One says something looks like it's wajib. Another evidence suggests that it's mustahab. Put it together, you move the wajib to mustahab. Khalas. So if so, the evidence is when you put them together, the ruling will go from wajib down to mustahab. Another way will go from haram to makruh. So you can see all those. So that's what it's called when they discuss something. What do? They put all the evidence on the table and then they'll analyze. If they find something apparently contradicting, then they try to harmonize them in one of these methods. Right? So for example, restricting one over, and one is general, one is specific, one is general, one is restricted, unrestricted. Put them together, the ruling goes from wajib to mustahab or haram to makruh, وهكذا. Or if it's something that says haram and the hadith looks like the other hadith suggests it's allowed, we could say that it's makruh or even open it to takhir, choice. So the ulama, they use these methods to make sure that the evidences are understood على نفس المراد على مراد الله, how Allah intended to be understood. Because who has the contradiction in their mind? The person who's reading the evidence, me and you or an alim. We think the contradiction, but we have to remember what is Allah intended by these evidences. So sometimes when you analyze the evidences, you can find that Allah really intended that is actually one is general, one is restricted. That's it. But we thought both of them are contradicting only because on face value, it didn't look like it works. That's why Allah says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Because they're going to do the work for you, not me and you. Because me and you, and especially lay people, when they look at evidences, immediately they see ta'arud. Because they're not looking at it sophisticated, surface level. Don't do. That's not a contradiction, first of all, right? And that's another problem. Contradictions is a very commonly used word inappropriately. For something to be a contradiction has conditions. So I know today's time people say this is contradictory. You tell them what are the shurut to ta'arud aslan. He doesn't even know. He just make it up. In my head, doesn't make sense. If Allah said, for example, don't do something today, and tomorrow He says do it, is there a contradiction there? No. Today don't do it. Tomorrow's a new day. Now do it. Khalas. There's no ittihad zaman. The time is not agreed upon. So examples like this allow us to know what? If the people of knowledge are resorted to, they know how to solve it. That's the good news. So our job is not to be doing that. Yes, the talib ilm is studying it to figure out, but imagine a layperson. Is he even supposed to be doing this? No, he's not supposed to be sitting there trying to figure out because he doesn't have the tools. So one of the good news is that if someone looks at two evidences, you and I might be like, I don't know, Ahlul ilm, easy. And if you want to see, go to the books of tafsir and the hadith. Ibn Khuzaymah, he says, rahimahullah, famously, bring me any two hadith apparently contradicting, I'll show you how to make a reconciliation. Any hadith, he said. Come on, like any, what do you got? What are you going to bring? And if you read, for example, some Mufassirin, how they do it, like for example, Alamat al-Shinqiti, right? Read his book. He has a book on contradictions in the Quran, apparently. Allahu Akbar, ayah min ayatillah, right? It's a signs of Allah, guys. The way you look at ayah, easy. And again, you also builds your confidence in the deen. You have to know this deen. No one can come today, some Christian or some nahuha on the street, the YouTubers, I got something. No. You don't even know what's going on. You're not even inside the door. You're at the door. You're not inside the house yet. And we have to know that, brother. Some people that come today, I found a hadith. Look at him. He's reading translation. Doesn't know any sharh, wala qawa'id, wala other thing. We just joke. It's a joke. But our deen should be also respected to the point that if someone did have it, like legitimately, then alhamdulillah, we can show them. Let's give an example so at least we could understand how that would look. And we're going to give an example of all three methods in a second. So an example, we have a hadith in Muslim, Zayd bin Khalid. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, أَلَا أُخْبِرُكُمْ بِخَيْرِ الشُّهَدَاءِ. Shall I not tell you who are the best of the shuhada, the martyrs? الَّذِي يَأْتِي بِشَهَادَةٍ, عفوا, the best of the intercessors. الَّذِي يَأْتِي بِشَهَادَةٍ قَبْلَ أَنْ يُسْأَلَهَا. Those who come to give their intercession before they were even asked. Hadith Muslim. But then we have another hadith, Imran Hussein. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said at the end of time, after 3 generations, the good generations, the 4th generation will come. And who are these people? إِنَّ بَعْدُكُمْ قَوْمًا يَخُونُونَ وَلَا يُؤْتَمَنُونَ وَيَشْهَدُونَ وَلَا يُسْتَشْهَدُونَ. A time will come, a people who come, they will be giving false testimonies, and they're coming forward to give testimonies when they weren't asked to. So the first part of the hadith says, the best of the interceders are those who, they come forward before being asked. But the Prophet said the 4th generation, downwards, after the Salaf, are people will come who will, وَيَشْهَدُونَ وَلَا يُسْتَشْهَدُونَ. They're going to give their intercession without being asked to. How do we explain that? So scholars say if you put the hadith together, the first one is praising the person who gives his intercession or his witness before being asked, and the second one is criticizing it. So if you add the evidences together, what is it going to be? The first one is praising the person who comes forward, is sahib al-haq, someone who's going and interceding for someone who has a rightful case. So you're going on your own behalf to help his case. As for the second one, the Prophet is criticizing people who are coming forward to give false testimony. Someone who is havan batil. And that's why the Prophet said this 4th generation or the Ummah ladder, that's what's going to happen. Khalas, that's it, jama'. So the first one's madah if you're doing for the right case, and the one's the criticism if you're doing it the wrong way. So no contradiction, right? Jama', the evidences are together. But if someone looks at the evidences and they say, okay, well, one hadith is more authentic. No, it's Muslim, both are Muslim. So what we have to do is say, what did the Prophet intend by the first hadith when he praised them, and why did he criticize the latter hadith? So the first one is because these people come when they do right. Another one, they're the 4th generation or downwards, they come and give testimonies and they lie. Right? So that makes sense. That's it. That's the example of Jama'ah. طيب. Now that we understand that such a method is there, let's move to the second one, which is abrogation. And we spoke about abrogation before, but just to touch on it, abrogation means you look at both evidences and try to determine if one is abrogated by something else or by another text. And the way abrogation is taught or learned, again, it has conditions, but we'll look to the date of the narrations. Who came first, who came later? Which Sahabi narrated this one, who narrated that one? So we might look for a date. For example, if it was this second year Islam, this is first year. So we'll try to figure out. Or we're going to look for the narrators. Who came to Islam before, him or her? Or him and him. And so if whoever came later must have the newer ruling. The one who came older had an older ruling, like this. If we can't find this, we may look for the companion. A companion might say, this ayah is abrogated, this hadith is abrogated. Qawl al-Sahabi, we take it. Another thing, the scholars agreed, an ayah is abrogated. Ijma', everyone says this ayah is abrogated. Or you might find, for example, a hadith that comes later, and we know it came later because it's late in the Prophet's life. So abrogation, it requires a lot more study, but the news is, in most cases, it's not going to be a case of abrogation, most cases. But you may find some cases where they are. That's why scholars, when they want to figure out if something is abrogated, they spend time looking at the conditions, looking at where it came, who narrated, and how to make that case. But just to claim something is abrogated is not correct. Right? You can't do that, because that would lead to the religion being unable to be practiced. Because imagine everything's abrogated, then what's the fa'idah of the deen? Right? It's gone. Because only for the early people, not for us. So an example, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right, initially Hadith Muslim, about ghusl. For the first ruling was Hadith Abu Sa'id, al-ma'u min al-ma'i, that a man would have to make ghusl if any kind of ejaculatory fluid or emission came out. That was the initial ruling. Ghusl after intimacy was only necessary if any kind of emission would come out from a man or a woman. And so that means if it didn't happen, then there was no ghusl wajib. But this was abrogated by Hadith Abu Hurairah. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa said, if any man who sits with his wife or has intimacy with his wife, then wajib al-ghusl. Ghusl is wajib. That's the latter ruling. So now, some of the scholars, when the Sahaba, even initially, they were debating, is ghusl wajib only when there's emission or no emission? And then the ruling is, even there's no emission, because the Hadith of Abu Hurairah came later, and Ubay ibn Ka'ab, he mentioned, إِنَّمَا كَانُ الْمَاءُ مِنَ الْمَاءِ رُخْصَةٌ فِي الْأَوَّلِ الْإِسْلَامِ ثُمَّ نُهِيَ عَنْهُ. So Ubay ibn Ka'ab said that was the beginning of Islam, we used to be this way, then we got changed. So therefore, we can see clear the Sahaba telling us the latter ruling. A man who was intimate with his wife, even if there is no, as long as there is penetration, there's no need for worry about emission or not, ghusl is wajib, that's it. So we can see how the ruling came because Sahabi told us. That's a clear example of abrogation and clear evidence. But other cases, it gets complicated, as we'll see. And sometimes Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam will tell us himself it's something abrogated. Like the hadith of visiting the graves. كُنْتُ نَهِيتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ فَزُورُوهَا. I used to prohibit you from visiting the graves, now go visit them. So what did he do? He's telling us, I prohibit you, now go. Khalas, his abrogation is gone now. Why? Because he said, I used to, now I'm not. Because what was feared upon initially is gone now. The Muslims are not going to have the correct way of doing the ziyarah. So abrogation, it comes less. But where you find most of it is the third category, at-tarjih. Preponderance is where most of the madahib and ulama are spending their time, because if they cannot harmonize and they cannot abrogate, they're left now to choose one evidence or one meaning or one indication over another. And hence, most of the ikhtilaf between the fuqaha and ulama is here, in tarjih. Just look at the sheer amount. If you go to any book of comparative fiqh and just see the sheer amount of difference of opinion, when you categorize it across the subject of tarjih or ta'arud, it's most. So how do the scholars even do this? How do they choose these opinions? Scholars, they say then, when they first realized you cannot harmonize, that's the first rule. You're not allowed to do tarjih if jama' is possible. That's the first principle, you can't. Okay, it's qa'idah first. There's no tarjih when jama' is possible. So if you can harmonize, there's no need to choose. Right? So that's why sometimes us, we just do tarjih, but we do haja. That's not al-ilm, right? Someone just doing tarjih because, and some people they just do it because it's, that's all they heard. Qawl rajih. Well, that's jama'. That's qawl rajih too, right? So sometimes we have to be careful that we don't realize that there's stages. So tarjih, one of the conditions, number one, to choose one view or the other, they cannot be harmonized. It's not possible because both evidence are two, right, seemingly contradictory. Second condition, we don't know the dates of either evidences. We have no abrogation method here. We don't have dating. Now, some scholars, of course, they will try their best to determine it, but when it's not clear cut, it's still open to ijtihad. And a case study we'll look at is touching the private parts, the break wudu or not. That's a beautiful example of all three methods. Because how many topics, how many debates or views are there? More than 5 views on topic. And every one of the views is either doing jama' or nasikh or tarjih. And one mas'ala. That's why the mas'ala is big khilaf. Because the ulama differed first in masalik, what path they took, then they differed in how they even took that path. Some did tarjih this way, that way, some did jama', some did nasikh. And it's very interesting. It's a beautiful example also of one mas'ala, how complicated it can get, but also how beautiful when you follow it, it is. Because even whatever view you hold, you're upon the way of the ulama because you're following their way. Before going there, these two conditions have to be met. So one, you can't harmonize. Two, we don't have the dates. So we cannot really, we have no history here to determine this. So what is the ruling when doing tarjih? Scholars say that it's wajib for the ulama, people of knowledge, to do this if they cannot act upon both. Because obviously this will lead to the fact that we're acting upon the Quran and Sunnah. And sometimes that is also part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted for us. Right? Because ittiba'u dalil, following the dalil which is rajih, is what Allah wants from us. قال الله تعالى وَاتَّبِعُوا أَحْسَنَ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكُم مِّن رَبِّكُم. Follow the best of that which is revealed to you from your Lord. Surah Zumar, ayah 55. الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَ. Those who listen to the speech and follow the best of it. Here the ulama say the best of it is to make tarjih. لأنه أحسن من مرجوح. To follow the stronger is better than following the weaker. So this is from the Quran. So when the ulama are telling you this is the correct view, instead of feeling, some people they get nervous, say, why so many different views? Yeah, this deen requires ijtihad, takalluf, right? This kind of helpful burden to get to Jannah. Right? Because at the end of the day, some may say, why don't Allah just make everything clear? Right? إِنَّمَا الْعِدْمُ الْجَزَاءِ مَعَ عِدْمَ الْبَلَاءِ. You got to struggle to get to Jannah. Well, mujtahid, he's got to draw a big effort. That's how you get to Jannah. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهُدُوا فِينَا نَهْدِيَنَا سُبُلَنَا. Today, people, they just want everything clear cut. No. Jannah is not getting like that. That's why Ahlul Ilm, they know. They spend so much time on one mas'ala, that's why they can't catch up with them. Their reward. Imagine, one mas'ala, they've been spending maybe years trying to figure it out. I mean, you're a miskeen, we don't make the effort. That's why he's going further than you. But that's part of the wisdom of deen, especially when some of the people complain that there's too much different topics. Tell them, akhi, where is Jannah, how is it going to be gained? Allah, that's when we actually think about it, it makes sense because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that people are sincere versus people just want to. So the basics are never like this. We're talking about the more finite topics. So the benefit is if you follow the stronger view, they did the best. But if you take a weaker view, thinking it's stronger, then you also took your view. So for example, if I do ijtihad, or I follow ijtihad of alim, I'm also doing my best following the view I think is stronger. But I'm allowed to change the view or to take a different view if I see it to be stronger, if I continue to research. That's the beauty of the deen as well. You keep going. طيب, how do you do it? Scholars, they mentioned there's lots of principles, but we'll summarize it just to make it simple. Number one, you do tarjih, you choose the stronger view based on the isnad or the sanad. Means which text is authentic and which is weak. So if one is sahih, one is da'if, where are we going? With the sahih. That's ijtihad bi sanad. So and that's why the ulama always say first thing we do, we check the tahqiq wa takhrij al-hadith. So that's why the fuqaha and the ulama, they work in tandem, right? The fuqaha and the ulama. And because the fuqaha and the muhaddithun are both acting on a helpful and complementary one another. So tarjih al-sanad it's called. You choose the stronger evidence over the weaker one. So most of us, we know that, right? If the hadith is da'if and it says something and the hadith says something else, well, da'if one's off the table, done. Second one, tarjih by way of the matan, by the text. Choosing stronger view based on the wording of the text. The matan, the actual textual evidence. So when we have a matan, remember every hadith is a sanad and matan. The Quran is only going to be matan, where the sanad is authentic, or we don't have to check that. So when we choose the text, what will we be doing? We're looking for wordings. Maybe we'll choose the wording, the clear wording over the unclear wording. Or maybe make it easier to say like explicit meaning over the implicit meaning. So when we studied before, al-mantuq yuqaddim ala al-mafhum. That's one of the principles. Mantuq means following the view based on the clear wording takes precedence over taking the ruling based on implied meaning. Which is stronger? The clear wording or the implied meaning? The clear wording, because that comes in the text. What implied meaning is ijtihad. So that's another example. So that's one way they would do it. Another way they will do it, they will try to do tarjih by the intended meaning, significant meaning, the dalalat we studied. So we'll look at, okay, this is aam, this is khas, this is muqayyid, to try to figure out which has the more correct interpretation. So interpretation of the text, not the wording only, the interpretation of it. Another example, we will make tarjih by changing the ruling. So the madlul, what's the in ruling? We all agree that there's two hadith, but instead of saying wajib, it says mustahab. That's a tarjih. Or we'll say it's makruh, not haram. So what did we do? We didn't change the wordings. We didn't change the meaning. We just changed the ruling. That's called the madlul. What's the final conclusion? The madlul. What is the hadith telling us? So as when we look at the case study, all of it will make sense. So what the scholars will do then, by look at the chain of transmission, the sanad, or look at the wording, or look at the meaning, or look at the ruling. Or what they'll do is they'll find outside evidences to strengthen one view. For example, which one is closer to the Quran? The Quran's wording. Which is the jumhur ulama on? Right? Can you do tarjih like that? Yeah. Who has the majority of scholars? Okay, that's more correct. Qawl rajih is with the jumhur. Although jumhur isn't always right? That's not always correct, but sometimes you can do that. So like this. So now that we know there's these levels, when we apply this to fiqh, it explains why the ulama even differed and how they solved the differing. This will now allow you, when you study an issue and you see two views, the question you should be asking yourself immediately, what maslak, what path or what tariqah, pathway are the ulama using to find the conclusion? Are they harmonizing, abrogating, or choosing preponderance? That's the first question you should be asking yourself. Because you're supposed to say, what are they doing? They're doing jama' or they're doing nasikh or tarjih. Next, how did they do it? Third, what's their conclusion? So instead of looking at the conclusion, we're interested also in the process. See, that's what's going to make you a student of knowledge. He just wants the madlul, halal, haram. He doesn't care how tarjih or shay, whatever you did there. Us, I'm not interested in makruh. I want to know how you got there. See, that's important because if we don't, otherwise you can't advance the knowledge. So now let's look at the mas'ala of touching the private parts and how the ulama dealt with this. To begin, Ibn Rushd in his Kitab al-Bidayat al-Mujtahid, he mentioned this is a difference of opinion amongst the ulama. And he mentioned the two opinions. Of course, there's more than two opinions. But he says the two overarching opinions. And look what he says. Either madhab, either of the ulama, either they took the madhab of tarjih, or the madhab of naskh, or the madhab of jama'. He says in the beginning. So remember, Ibn Rushd is very important because he's the first of the major scholars to actually tell you why the ulama differed. Sabab ikhtilaf. So he expels it out. Because when you read the fiqh books, it's not clear what's going on. You just see different views. So he said the reason why they differed, because they differed on how to approach the difference. One group harmonized, one group abrogated, and one group chose one over the other. Everyone's with me so far? So he says actually, he mentioned three views, but he says there's two. So there's three views. If you read all the different fiqh books, you find there's actually 5 groups. And even more, right? There's even more, but 5 at least. So all of us, we hold one of these 5 views. Right? Most of us, right? One of them. Inshallah, right? Otherwise you're doing your own ijtihad, right? So one of the 5 views you're holding. طيب, what's your view? Let's see how they reached it. Group 1. So before we go there, where is the difference of opinion? What's going on? There's 2 hadith in the chapter. Okay? Hadith number 1. So this is where the difference is. Hadith number 1, hadith Busra. And hadith number 2, hadith Tariq bin Ali. So there's 2 hadith. Hadith Busra and hadith Tariq bin Ali. So what are these hadith telling us? Right? They're telling us, right, that the hadith of Tariq Busra said, who saw it is abrogating hadith Tariq bin Ali, who said, then they said it is so these 2 hadith. So one hadith says that the touching the private parts breaks the wudu. Another hadith says touching the private part doesn't break the wudu. So that's the 2 views generally. And again, both the hadith are there in Bulugh Maram, both authentic hadith. So before we move on, the hadith are authentic. So once we understand this, the hadith are authentic, then what we need to do is how do we reconcile them? Because one is saying that, so hadith Busra bin Safwan says, whoever touches the private part doesn't have to, he should not perform wudu until he has to go make wudu. And hadith Tariq saying that it's part of your body, no problem. So Busra's hadith breaks the wudu. Tariq bin Ali doesn't break the wudu. Everybody's with me so far? Those are 2 hadith. So why did the scholars differ? How do you reconcile them? Because it's apparently different, contradictory, right? Doesn't break, breaks. So now we have 5 groups. To summarize them, group number 1. Group A, right? Again, there's many scholars in this group. Who they say the first group, it breaks the wudu. So group 1 says it breaks the wudu. Whose view is this? View of Umar ibn Khattab, Sa'd ibn Waqas, Ibn Umar and others. They say touching the private parts breaks the wudu. Breaks the wudu. Okay, and some of their views, some of these Sahaba, they held the view unrestrictedly. Right? They just, if you touch the fire, it breaks the wudu. And what's their rationale? What's their reasoning? They made tarjih. They chose one view over other. What is the hadith they're choosing? They chose the hadith of Busra or the hadith of Talaq. So for group one says it breaks the wudu. Amongst them are Sahaba who hold this view, Sa'ad, Waqas, Umar and others. How did they reach this view? Tarjih. They chose one hadith over the other. Which hadith they chose? Hadith Busra, that says it breaks the wudu. And they said the hadith Talaq is weak. So what are they doing here? Who can tell me? What kind of tarjih are they doing? بسند. طيب ترجيح بسند. So the hadith Talaq is ضعيف, hadith Busra is sahih. That's how they went. Amongst those in the same camp, the same group, they held the hadith is both authentic, but they said hadith Busra does naskh of the hadith of Talaq. So they took the same view, but they used abrogation. Path number 2. How? They say Busra came to Islam after Talaq Ma'ari. And it's actually proven in the books of Tariq. So they have the same view, but their rationale is not tarjih, naskh, abrogation. Same view, but. So that shows you, sometimes you can have the same view, we reach a different way. Okay, but so that's the first view. Group 2, it doesn't break the wudu. And you probably can guess, right, how they reached that. But their view, this is Ali, Ibn Mas'ud, Hudayfa, and others of the Sahaba. So Sahaba, how did they reach it? They acted upon the hadith Talaq versus the hadith of Busra. And what did they say? The hadith Talaq is sahih, and hadith Busra is da'if. So the same masalak, they used tarjih with sanad, but the other way around. They made tad'if of the hadith Busra, and they made tasahih of the hadith of Ali. Ali, the hadith, they say Talaq Ali is hadith sahih, Busra's hadith is weak. So opposite, right? This went the other way. And now, when you look at this, someone will say, how did they even know that? Well, in order to find out what hadith is sahih or not, they rely upon the great imams. So Ali al-Madini, the great muhaddith, he said the hadith of Busra is better than the hadith of Talaq. And Bulugh Maraq, Ibn Hajj puts that there. So why am I mentioning this? Because even tarjih, sanad, fihi ijtihad. Which tasheeh are you taking? That's another door itself, right? Because you might say Sahih al-Albani, you might say Da'afu Ahmed. What are you going to do here? Right? So yeah, that's another, that's different. That's when you go to hadith, then you have to go over there, come back. But now you can see they just went the other way around. Makes sense, right? It's not very hard, right? Now you can see, okay, that makes sense. How about group 3? Group 3 said it's recommended to make wudu, but not wajib. They said recommended, not wajib. So what they're doing is they're going from different way here. And whose view is this? This is view of Imam Ahmed, in one of his opinions. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Uthaymin, and others. They say it's only mustahab, but wajib. Okay, how? What is the rationale? Al-Jama'. They harmonized. How? Harmonization by way of the madlul, the hukum. Hadith Talaq says it doesn't break the wudu. Hadith Busra says it breaks wudu. Put it together, mustahab, wala wajib. That's it. And this view has a lot of strength because al-jama' awla min tarjih. They're following that principle. And number 2, it's easier for people. Some of us are thinking, I like that view. It makes my life easier. Right? So they're going by way of because they're saying in had deen yusr. They have other evidence. The deen's easy, come on. And actually that view has strength. I'm not gonna lie, that's one of the strong views on the table. This is actually a strong view. But we're not done yet, right? So before we get to that, you have to check all views, right? That view is strong so far, stronger than the other 2. So why is it stronger? So that's important. For example, you leave this majlis and you say, I like that view. Why you like that view? Because it makes my life easy. That's not the way the fiqh is supposed to talk. You're supposed to say because they use jama' is awla. Right? That's what you're supposed to see. This will give you also confidence that this is the correct view. This also shows that when they argued, they were actually arguing that is it correct to be choosing or should we just first harmonize? So they said, why can't we harmonize it? By moving the ruling of hadith al-Busra from wajib, like the Prophet said, whoever touches his private part breaks the wudu. When he says it breaks the wudu, it seems to be like it does. But the hadith of Ali, Talaq says it doesn't, so it probably means it's better to. Wouldn't that be a way to understand it? So that's what they're doing. طيب. So they move the contradiction away by just going. This is a very strong view, as we'll see. And there's other evidences they use. Group 4, they say if one touches their private parts with desire, it breaks the wudu. But if it doesn't, if you touch it without desire, it doesn't break the view. It's a very common view amongst the ulama. If you touch it with desire, breaks the wudu. If you touch it just by accident or when cleaning yourself, doesn't break the wudu. Whose view is this? Imam Ahmed, another view. Imam Malik in one view, and Shaykh al-Albani, that's his view, amongst others. So what are they doing? What's their way? They're doing jama', they're also harmonizing. But what are they doing? Taqyid mutlaq. They're restricting the hadith of Busra right, to mean if touched with desires. So the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever touches the private parts with desires, that's what they're saying, breaks the wudu. If not, hayy talaq. So jama' by way of restricting the unrestricted. There. Taqeed al-mutlaq. That makes sense. That's also jama'. So it's also a strong view. Because they're using harmonization. But what's the issue here? While this view has strength in the method, the questions are still on the table. Where did they get the desire and not desire from? So that's not proven, right? So there's some may say, well, the qaid, the restriction you're using, the restricting method is sound but not textually supported. Where do we get it from? So truth be told, it's a weaker view. Why? Because even though the method is correct, we don't have delil for that. Where did that desire part come from? Whereas the last group, they didn't go there. They just went to the hukum. They didn't even change the meaning. Group 5, they say if one touches the private part directly without a barrier, it breaks the wudu. But if you touch it behind the barrier with your clothes, it doesn't break the wudu. And this view, what do? Jama', they also harmonize by way of taqeed mutlaq. They use also restrictions. They're restricting the hadith of Busra with the hadith by bringing another hadith. And what's the hadith? The hadith of Abu Hurairah fi Sahih al-Jami', Shaykh al-Albani authenticated. Prophet said, if anyone touches the private parts with his hand without a barrier, then the wudu is wajib on him. So Wallahu a'lam, I think that view is the strongest. Because if you use jama' by way of taqeed mutlaq, وعندهم نص خلاص والله أعلم, I think that's a stronger view because they are using taqeed bin dalil. But the second strongest view would be والله أعلم, group 3. Right, so those are two strong views. If you take group 4's view, it's still strong in the method, but the problem is where did the desire part come from? We couldn't textually support it. So now we can see that the first two groups are not strong. Someone asked you why? Why isn't it strong? What are you going to answer? Because they did tarjih when you could have done jama'. Khalas. You already found the qawaid now. So put those aside. Let's go with those with the jama'. Who's correct? Okay, the one who has dalil goes up. The one who has a good ta'leel, reasoning goes up. The one who has none, it goes down. So between the views 3 and 5, Wallahu a'lam. Any view you take is okay too, because if you don't know any better, you research. But now you can see if someone asks you why does you make wudu, and you say I think without barrier, and then someone will say how you got it, you spell it out for them, mashallah. And that's how the ulama deal with it. But if someone said how come some ulama took a different view, what did the Prophet ﷺ say about the person that just jihad? Either the hakim and hakim, if a ruler makes a ruling, or judge or sheikh, ijtihad, and he makes ijtihad, and he gets it right, how much reward does he get? 2. And if he gets it wrong, he gets 1. So ulama, it's okay. If according to you, according to him, he's still getting reward. Our job is to take the view we think strongest, but today if someone asks you, why are you taking these views? That is a question we should be asking ourselves. Shouldn't be that we're muqallidun. Because this deen had a deen. This deen is about talab ilm, right? But if you're ami and you ask your local sheikh and he said it doesn't break the wudu, then you did your best. But if you're talab ilm, you say, okay, why do I hold this view? Now you're going to go home and look at all these and say, okay, now I'm going to figure out which view I hold. And that's what sometimes you change one view, you go here. But the beauty of it, whatever view you take, at least you're following, right? And that's the beauty of this. That's one mas'ala, or you practice all of these. There's more. But for the sake of time, maybe we mention one more. But hopefully it makes sense how the ulama deal with it. And there's more principles that I mentioned. So sometimes it gets really sticky, some of the issues, because the principles get more and more, right? So when there's more seeming contradictions or seemingly different ways of harmonizing, the more principles are put on the table. Another principle, another principle, another principle. So sometimes you have a lot of qawaid. So the beauty is that the more you learn those qawaid, the more you can see the application. For example, salah. Some of the issues of salah are clear-cut. Some issues are not. So when you look at how to deal with it, the first question you should ask, okay, whoever held this view, what did they do? Who held this view, what did they do? So your job is to figure out the views, figure out the evidences, figure out how they reached it, and then what happens, try to figure out in your estimation, and again, over time you might change your view, which is correct. If you're doing this, you're going to become a strong student of knowledge. You're going to become a proper person, proper understanding. Because you go into every issue like this, every mas'ala, في باب العقيدة والفقه, tafsir, like this. But today what happens is that people may say something they might hear, but that's different between someone who studied it and someone who didn't. So our job is to try to go through the process. Later on, over time, you're going to become so good at even understanding who's right, who's wrong. But it's by the nature of the argument, oh, this is this and that. You can even, as you see, some of the ulama, how they respond to each other. Bi'ilm, right? They respond back with knowledge, and it becomes a beautiful conversation because it's bi'adab, bil'ilm. Whereas the awam, the problem they have is that they're not the best with difference of opinion because they get nervous, right, when they hear difference of opinion. So sometimes you just tell them qul rajih because you don't want to confuse them. But sometimes also it's good to them to understand that if you had someone else tell you something else, there's more than one view. It's useful to know that. طيب, we'll mention one more view and we'll end with this, inshallah ta'ala. Because the ulama in these kinds of conversations, you look and you study these issues, you also practice in trying to figure out how to practice this. Another example, sleeping, right, breaks wudu, as we know. But in the ulama, they differed in terms of what sleep breaks the wudu. So they differ in the sifa, what type of sleep. Is it light sleep? Is it heavy sleep? Sleep sitting down? Sleep lying down? Right, so all these views. So when you study this issue, you can go home, you research it. There's at least 3 opinions of which type of sleep breaks it. One group said any sleep, light or deep, breaks wudu. Group 2, none of the sleep breaks wudu. Group 3, if you sleep a certain way, breaks the wudu. Another way doesn't break the wudu. Another group comes another way. So each one had a way of trying to, because why are they differing? They're differing on how to do tarjih of the hadith on the table. So you can go home, you can research that, you can see how they reached it, and you find out the same thing. One group takes this hadith, one group takes that hadith, one group didn't have a hadith, they used a rational argument. Another group, they have the better way of solving it. So, summary, anyone who has what's it called, sahih? Which one breaks the wudu? If you lose conscious, so heavy sleep versus light sleep. Now will be the, Wallahu a'lam, a stronger view. And some ulama how they view that, it's just any sleep. Right? And then you find different methods. Some say if you sit upright, so again, when you study, you're going to find out most of us probably hold that view. If it's heavy sleep, means you don't know your awareness, you lost awareness of where you are, breaks the wudu. If you don't, then you're good to go. And the reason why, is we'll see, if you go to look at it, you'll find that. Right? We don't want to prolong it more, but this is the end of these lessons, because the last chapter, obviously, ulama talk about after that, the bab al-ijtihad with taqleed, and that's not really applying to us as much. So inshallah ta'ala, we'll end with this. I don't have any questions. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll take it. Bidna ta'ala, yes. No, the hadith of Abu Hurairah, yeah, he was sick hadith talk, yeah.
Yeah, so it's why is it that despite that Sheikh Al-Albani still went for the opinion that it's sahab, or that it only breaks the wudu based on desire, even though
Yeah, they look at the hadith, they don't use the hadith as the proof, they use ta'leel, the reasoning, which is that if you touch your private part with desires, an emission will come out. Emission breaks wudu, not touching. So they looked at the reason behind the ta'leel. Why the Prophet said touch your private parts? Because if you touch your private parts, something will come out. That breaks wudu. So that's the rationale. Not touching by itself. Or the other group saying no, touching by itself breaks the wudu. So that's what their view is. So they say if you touch with desire, something will come out. That's why it breaks wudu. Right? So now you can see that they have also an argument. So they're saying the hadith touching without a barrier, they will also look at it and say without a barrier and desire. Because they're looking at what's the reason for it, what's the hikmah or the illah behind it, the illah, sorry. So that's the reasoning. But we can say that, Allahu a'lam, that since the last one has actual hadith that says without a barrier, we just stick to Zahir Nas. If you touch it, not if touch and something comes out. But again, it's all difference of opinion, right? That's the beauty of it. Yes. So both groups, they argue, the first group 1 and 2, one of the hadith is weak, but what's more correct is both hadith is sahih. That's more correct. So if someone does take the view that they're weak, then khalas, his tarjih is easy. And that's another thing we have to understand. When some masail, if you are a person who knows hadith, you can make the tahqiq of the hadith. If you say the hadith is weak and one is strong, you already solved the issue for yourself. So sometimes with salah, for example, simple salah al-Imam al-Albani, most difference of opinion amongst the ulama regarding Shaykh al-Albani's viewpoints comes from the sahih hadith. They differ with him on the authenticity of the hadith. But Shaykh al-Albani is a muhaddith, so he gives the hadith authenticity and then he makes the hukum on it and he brings those who agree with him. But if you see some of the ulama how they respond to some of his views, the first difference is that they differ on the hadith. That's it. So that's fair. That's fair game. So that's why some cannot say Shaykh al-Albani is bringing new views. No, it's with tasheeh. And tasheeh and tad'if is ijtihadi as well in many angles. So that's why if you do believe the hadith is weak, then you don't have to worry. This is a simple issue. But when we look at both hadith, majority of ulama say both hadith authentic. Hence, we have to go to tarjih bil matan. We can't go on the sanad. Right? And that's what we're going to see. But you notice that this is another angle that needs to be investigated properly. But some of the ulama, they are also independent scholars of hadith. So because the independent scholars of hadith, they first authenticate hadith or weaken it, then they go into this conversation about which is not correct or not. So an example, Shaykh Albani brings in Sifat Salah, the hadith about looking at the place of prayer when you're making, when you're praying Salah, you look at the mawdu' al-sujood, the place of sujood. That hadith Aisha, I believe hadith Bayhaqi, hadith da'if according to many ulama. But Shaykh Albani says sahih, so that's why he says it's recommended when you're praying to look at the place of sujood. But the second opinion, which is Imam Malik's view and some of the Sahaba, you look straight. Because they say the hadith da'if, there's no hadith, the hadith is not strong, so they go up then to the ayah, وَوَلِّ وَجْهَكَ الشَّطْرَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ. Face your faces to the Masjid al-Haram, the Qibla, looking straight. And then they bring some hadith, Sahaba looking straight. Now some will say, subhanAllah, how is this the case? Well, Shaykh Ibn authenticated hadith, that's where he's standing. But if you say hadith da'if, that's where you're going. But if you also argue the Sahaba or the other, some of the Salaf or the view look down at the place of sujood, that's how you're going to argue. That even though the hadith is da'if, you could say that qawl al-Sahaba and Salaf is to look at the place of sujood. But when you see some ulama say hadith da'if, then they're actually right, if they believe that. But because Shaykh Ibn said sahih and you agree with his authenticity, then we go with that. That's the beauty of also looking at how the ulama are respectful of the differences. Because ikhtilaf al-ulama is ikhtilaf al-uqul, difference in interpretation and minding. Whereas ikhtilaf al-awam is ikhtilaf al-qulub. That's our problem. Khilaf, we start fighting each other. What does that have to do with anything? Right? Like no one, you put it here or there, come on, man. It's fiqh, right? They're supposed to use that's our problem. So sometimes even it's one of the problems we have to understand, like what's really happening. Allahu alam, yes. So that's the thing. The hadith is talking about the front parts. As for the back, the some ulama say is not. And some say it is. So they differed on that as well. Because when massa dhakarahu, whoever touches his front part. So some say it's the same meaning for the back and some say it's not. So there is a difference on that. But generally some scholars say it's mustahab means for any both of them, if you take that view. And those who say it breaks the wudu, they say the front and some say it's both. That's precautionary. But so there's even that difference in terms of what part breaks the part. Right, so that's so. But the first rule which I find is a break. That's where we went. But you're right. If you say mustahab, doesn't matter, right? Which part you touch. Yes. So the third view, they argue that it's recommended because one hadith says it breaks your wudu, one hadith says it doesn't break your wudu. So to go in the middle, it can be it does break your wudu and doesn't. It must mean that it's mustahab to make wudu, because the first one looks like it's wajib to make wudu again, and the second one says it's not wajib. So what is the middle then? Recommended. And the reason why they recommended it says because the Sharia, obviously, when the Prophet said it breaks the wudu, they bring other examples like the issue of making ghusl when you wash a dead body. Same issue. It's the same. The hadith says you have to make wudu and some they don't. So mustahab. So why? Madlul. What's the ruling? So what do you understand hadith Busra? You must make wudu. Hadith Talaq says you don't have to make wudu. So what does that tell you then? Wajib and or not wajib? Mustahab. So that's how they went. So that is also looking at the wider angle of the deen, because they also argue, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said this, but how many Sahaba narrated the hadith? Only one. So they also take a look at the practice of Sahaba. Is it true that they used to hold that view or not? So they also bring other evidence to show that it's probably mustahab. So that's a nice view because it goes in the middle. It also shows you that well, instead of just saying, looking at it does or doesn't, why can't we go in the middle and just change the ruling instead of changing the intended meaning? Right? So again, a fair and rational argument. They have other evidences. That's so. What they're going to do, they're going to look at the two hadith and they're going to make extra hadith and adillah to try to strengthen such a interpretation. And that shows you also how sound that view is. Right? So that view is strong. Yeah, it's strong. Another question, yes. So obviously, if we're choosing, when doing tarjih, yes, we look at the sanad first because we want to make sure they're both authentic to go to the next step. So it's so easy. If one hadith is very weak, or majority of is weak, we don't have to even entertain the hadith. So you cannot say the contradiction hadith is not established because it's not there. So you're right. You might first look at the asanid. And that's why first in do tahqiq al-hadith, hukm al-hadith, then fiqh al-hadith. So Shaykh Albani, what he noticed is, his book, his big book, Kitab al-Asr, Sifat Salah, he brings you all the first isnad, all the asanid, tahqiq al-hadith, then he does the fiqh. Because first you have to establish it's authentic. So you're right, like if the sanad is da'if, then we don't need to go look at the ma'na as much. But if the weakness of the hadith is there, but let's say the ulama acted upon it, because some hadith are weak, but the ulama acted upon it as an ummah generally, then that one we can also entertain. So we can see later that yes, you can also go further. But you're right, you first must check the hadith. And that's why we always focus on authenticity a lot. Why? Because if it's not authentic, then what are we doing, right? What are we discussing? So an example would be some of the major fiqh views or madahib, because their checking is not as authentic or rigorous as the muhaddithun. Because the fuqaha are not like the muhaddithun when it comes to tahqiq. Some of the ulama, they look at it if it's acted upon, or they have more lenient conditions of tasheeh. So because of this, some madhabs you find when you read the mas'ala, it says, it's not a hadith we can act upon. But they put it in there as, and then they bring extra evidence to establish it. But other ulama say, well, for instance, it's weak. Let's just move on to if there's something authentic. The other issue becomes when there's no evidences. We're doing tarjih biqiyas. That's the most tricky one, because we're one qiyas or another qiyas. We're all working with nothing. Right? So that's when sometimes we have to be careful. Some masail, you know what has dalil. But it's ta'leel. Everyone's whose rationale is better. Right? So masail you can research, for example, the ulama when they discuss the issue of whether or not it's wajib for a woman to serve her husband in her house or not. Some think it's a khilaf there. Some ulama say it's ijma', but some say no, it's not ijma'. So we're going to say ikhtilaf, okay, طيب. So what's the ikhtilaf here? Ta'leel. Right? Both are arguing different ways, is it wajib or not? So you're going to find a hadith that says, wajib, your wife take care of your cooking and cleaning? It's a hadith like that. Like wording like that. So what are we left with? We're left with ta'leel. So sometimes some issues you have to understand whose rationale is stronger, plus who has amal salaf. That's how we're going to go. So qawl sahih is wajib, just in case you're doubtful, it's wajib. Right? بتعليل وتلازم وقول الصحابة والسلف. Yeah, but we're not gonna forget that it is such a different. So sometimes what happens though, just to help us understand it, sometimes there's no evidence on any of the sides. So there are some fiqh issues, everyone is just differing on what is the most appropriate interpretation of this issue based on what we know generally of the deen. So that means that we have to come down a little bit, because we're all acting upon the best opinions. But sometimes what happens when you're studying this, you have to also appreciate that there are such discussions, right? But they're not as many as the one we talked about today. So that's the good news, not as many. طيب, shall we end with this much?